We want to see what happens. We want to build a world, right? Create guidelines for what can and what could or could not be in there, and then push those limits as far as we can to really hone in on what the aesthetic is, and then create as much variety as we can within those confines.
Atmosphere and gravity are roughly equivalent to Earth. It looks like we can breathe out there. It's -10 here in the crater, Commander. It's cold.
No life signs on the surrounding plateau. Past that, there's too much sensor interference to tell. In this episode, we will be hearing from the world builder and musician Magos Buer. The discussion covers infusing play with literary themes and collaboration. While listening, reflect on how you make meaning from play.
I found home in the 28 community because I have such a lack of competitive desire as a human being. Yeah. I know a lot of people who do, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But that just, I don't know I don't know if it died within me or if it just wasn't a natural part of my personality to begin with. But I'm just not a competitive person. And Inc. 28 doesn't, there's nothing competitive about it. Yeah. I think of us creating something more cinematic.
Can you talk a little bit about how you incorporated storytelling into Gelida, both in like your preparation, but also like at the table?
I had certain narrative expectations in my mind when first forming the group for Gelida. This is long before the event or the events or any games of any kind took place. And those changed a lot over time with feedback from other people who made very valid points about how it could be improved or could be different. And it changed a lot over time simply because, when it comes to the building a setting, it's the child that's raised by the village. so to speak. I think the best approach is to realize that once you've set one, and again, this initial part is also very much a team effort. I believe the best way to put together a setting after having the experience, very positive experience and very fortunate experiences that I've had with settings, I think that the best way to form your ideas is to have a committee, but a very trusted one, very organic, small people you really can trust to give you good, honest feedback that you can rely on. People who create art that you aesthetically are aligned with, that you personally take joy in, that you all create art you all respect. Not to say that I don't respect other forms of art, but when you're trying to achieve a certain goal, you want people who are on the same page. Like if you were trying to create like a setting for a 28 style game that was like a cyberpunk sort of setting, right? Then you probably wouldn't consult the same people that I did for Jolita.
Yeah.
Right.
That makes sense.
You would want to speak with painters and writers and creators who created that kind of art and you respected it tremendously. Those would be the kind of people you would want to bring in on the ground floor if you can convince them to help you do the fundamentals. So for Jolita, the fundamentals we were trying to establish, and I think hopefully successfully did, was the aesthetic, was the character of the world itself, and the restrictions, what isn't included, which I think is the most important part. Try to communicate, this is what they look like. This is how their vehicles operate. This is how focused are they on vehicles? I mean, how many people are generally around? And you need to go over all of that, which we did, and kind of came to a successful head. And once you've really established, your restrictions and narrowed your scope of what exactly would fit the aesthetic of your setting, then everything that anybody builds for your setting after that, so long as they're actually adhering to, the restrictions of what the world is like, will immediately tell its story. It all happens organically after that.
Interesting.
There are some things about Jolita that I think are slightly different than some other settings, and that's that I tried my very best to work to make the way that a game is played and the way that a war band is built, or in this case a convoy, which is what they're called on Jolita.
I love that.
Down to the composition of your group itself was all made to convey the atmosphere of Jolita. And I don't think all settings do that. I think a lot of them do. But I wanted Jolita to feel cold, feel lonely, and feel isolated. And I had not seen that in settings prior. And the settings that I admired most, that I was taking a lot of inspiration from, that wasn't an angle that I think people had explored. And so I made the character creation and the convoy creation for your group focused on a very small amount of models, usually piloting a vehicle. So for the most part, when people were playing a game, if you're playing one-on-one, often you would be dealing with 1 to 3 vehicles and their pilots.
Interesting. Yeah.
Maybe a few more. But as a result, when you play a game, it's supposed to represent a very chance encounter, because anyone who on Jolita ventures outside of the equator and outside of the cities is going to have a very hard time surviving. And not many people take that chance. Obviously, if you're playing the game of Jolita, your convoy did. Your convoy took that chance, likely because humanity would die if you didn't. So you're probably trying to save your family or your community or your city by venturing out to try to find resources, or maybe saving yourself, or maybe just trying to make a buck, right? Taking the high risk to to loot dead bodies or loot vehicles from people who've fallen prior. And you running into another convoy is a very chance encounter. It's not, it's supposed to represent you might have been out there for weeks.
Yeah.
Before you ran into another person who's alive. And then if you're competing over the same resources, that's a dramatic thing. But again, it's a very cold and isolated and lonely world. And I tried to bake that into the rules.
That's cool.
And that I've tried to carry that philosophy into settings that followed. And I hope to carry that philosophy into settings in the future, that when I run things, I want to try my best to show rather than tell.
Oh yeah.
Just make the rule set and make the world structured in such a way that by participating in it, that it should give a little bit of an ambiance of the underpinning philosophy that I had in mind when creating the world in the first place.
Yeah. I'm really interested in this idea of like infusing the setting and play with a philosophy and themes. Like, I feel like Jolita had like a point of view in a way that I feel like Warhammer like comes from a group of creators who had a point of view, and there was like the whole satirical element, and then slowly over time it's become more corporate and vanilla, and now it's more like people who are like, explosions are good and I just am excited to see a big robot. But like the like earlier versions where it's like this is like a satire of like totalitarianism, or like maybe other sort of bureaucratic techno processes gone to their extreme, and there was like this sense that like it had a philosophy and has lost it. And I think like you've done a really good job of like infusing the philosophy back into play and into the setting in a way that I hadn't seen like since I was like first encountering the game. And can you speak a little bit more about like how your approach to like incorporating, I think you've mentioned like Nietzsche and maybe some other philosophers, or at least like sort of, can you speak a little bit about that and how you work that into the game itself?
Yeah, of course. So, by the way, thank you for mentioning all that, because I couldn't agree more. When Warhammer was fresh and new, I was too young to understand just how many philosophical underpinnings the background of the game itself had. Now that I'm an adult, I appreciate it, although I do think a lot of it is pulled from Dune.
Yeah.
It's a very Dune-like setting.
Yeah.
But unlike Dune, I feel that until recently, every addition to the game was a new satire of a new utopianism. But like beyond the fascism of the Imperium, the greater good of the Tau also stands as a wonderful satire for communism.
Yeah.
And every faction since has done, I believe, a great job of showing just how quickly things can deteriorate when you believe in one version of a utopian world and the ends justify the means.
Yeah. And
Warhammer used to speak to that, I believe, that the galaxy burned and there was only war, and it seemed the reason being is because every faction in Warhammer believed they were right. And not one of them was willing to hear anything else. And they all had their own versions of totalitarianism, because all of their societies were formed around billions of beings who had seceded their power to the ideologues of the state, whatever that state may be, right? Instead of forming their own communities, there's there's so much that could be learned from every angle of that.
Yeah.
There's satire of communism, of individualism, of fascism, of socialism, of every ism you can imagine. They've done a decent job of satirizing how any of that stuff can go wrong. Take it too far, any of it.
Yeah.
No matter how good your intention. And I also believe you're right that that much of the modern game has been washed down and doesn't have much of it. Like, for example, Leagues of Atan is probably the newest Warhammer 40K faction.
Yeah.
And as much as I actually like them, I don't believe that there's much in the lore that I've found, at least so far, that touches on any of those classic philosophical underpinnings that, generally speaking, you would find in classic Warhammer lore.
Yeah.
As much as they're just the noble dwarves who showed up again.
Yeah.
So in Gelida, on the other hand, philosophically speaking, I don't view it as a satire necessarily. There's definitely many things about the setting that would come across as satire, because I tried my best not to stray away from the DNA that was core to Warhammer in its prime.
Honestly, I felt it was really sincere, like,
but what
authentic.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it came across that way.
Yeah.
But as you had said before, you are right. I took a lot of Nietzschean inspiration, specifically regarding Nietzsche's greatest claim that God is dead and we killed him. Nietzsche said that with sorrow in his heart. He predicted accurately before the events that transpired after his death, that millions upon millions would die as a result of the death of religion and religious morality in the wake of rationalism, because the rationalist movement with the advancement in logic that we as human beings experienced in the early 1900s would have a damning effect that only he seemed to foretell. I'm sure that there were other theologians and other philosophers who maybe made similar portents, but
like a Dostoevsky or somebody
was
like
very
that.
serious in his claim that we, but I mean, Dostoevsky was an incredible, I mean, groundbreaking philosopher. I mean, just as important, if not more important, than Nietzsche. But unlike Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, I mean, had a very religious solution to that. He believed that we abandon the Christian tenets at our peril. Which, there are arguments to be made for that, like whether or not you are religious or whether or not you are an atheist. I think it's very foolish to throw the baby out with the bathwater. To say that there's nothing good to be gleaned from a book that survived thousands of years and been a rock steady moral compass for so many people. There's plenty of it that also can be viewed as negatively, depending on your moral compass as well. And there's plenty of awful things that have been done in the name of religion as well. It's a complicated issue, but
for sure. I think when I go back to, when I go back to,
no, you're okay.
You were talking about like competitive play, and I oftentimes think of this like the burden of utility and the way that competitive play is like forces you to play a specific way because of rationality and utility, and it's like you are imprisoned by optimization. And I feel like Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were both talking about this, like, you will be imprisoned by utility, you will be imprisoned by optimization, because scientific rationality will force every decision that you make to be optimized,
Right.
and you will lose yourself in
Yes.
this. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you lose the spirit of the game in the
Yeah.
context of Warhammer
Yeah.
very, very quickly in the moment. I mean, think of how often people talk about a quote unquote format being solved in
Yeah.
regards to
Exactly. Yeah.
Warhammer, you know? And I
Yeah.
always think to myself, like, why aren't you playing StarCraft? Like, I
Oh,
get it,
totally. Yeah.
you know, I get that there's a competitive rush to playing in a very high stakes environment and playing to the best of your ability with the best list you could build,
Yeah.
right? But Warhammer just doesn't seem like the game, so to speak. You know, it just
Yeah.
seems tough in my
Yeah.
mind. Can you imagine pouring, like, you know, if you're paying like retail price for your army, sometimes some people are paying like $1,000 to put their money, their army on the table, if not $2,000,
Yeah.
right? And then if it's a tournament where things need to be fully painted, right? A lot of those people are paying to have it painted rather
Yeah.
than painting it themselves, right? So they've paid to have this beautiful army painted. They paid $2,000 to have it done, and the day before the tournament comes out, they release the Votan tokens.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
because you're a competitive player, you're like, well, and then you just put those on a shelf to collect dust,
Yeah.
whatever army you were playing before, because you're like, Votan are the new thing. And it's just it's so tough
Yeah.
for me to picture that having that as a priority in regards to the hobby anymore, specifically. And I don't know if this is an original point, but it is what I think of it, like the exact same argument you're making. I've had that thought, and I think that part of what strips the spirit of the game from the very once you get to a utilitarian level when you're
Yeah.
playing Warhammer or any game that you're playing,
Yeah.
I think is because of instrumentality.
Mm.
Like, how can you truly have a relationship with the person across the table from you, right? If all when it comes to playing the game, right, that you might have good sportsmanship and shake hands in the end and maybe you'll be friends,
Yeah.
but during the game, you know, your models are instruments. They're instruments to deliver you to victory, and anything that can't get you there is disposable.
And even that you treat
and
your opponent as an
opponent's
instrument.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, it doesn't have to be that way. I've known plenty of competitive players who are great sportmen or have great sportsmanship, and they never see their opponent as they never dehumanize their opponent.
Yeah.
Right. They just they take all of their competitiveness out on the game itself, the game that's being played.
Yeah.
Right. But they often are going out to drinks with their opponent after the game has concluded. They're often, you know, their families are hanging out together. They're going barbecues together. They're very close and tight knit. Even if they lost to that person in a high stakes tournament, they're still able to just shake their hand and enjoy the experience. Yeah. Because to them, the competitive nature of the game is what's paramount. But even then, I still have a difficult time personally taking a game that is so hobby oriented, where every model has to be put together and every model has to be based with some type of basing material of your choice. And every model has to be painted, right? And if you're involved in that process, then it's so difficult, at least for me, to treat them as instruments.
Yeah.
You know, it's so hard for me to treat them as mere game pieces. Yeah. That are disposable when they are no longer of maximal utility.
Yeah. Right.
In regards to Gelida and how Gelida has panned out philosophically, as I had said before, it's a very Nietzschean sort of setting because it had to do much more with his claim that God was dead. And in the world of 40K, as we all know, the Emperor built the Imperium on a secular set of ideals, and in a sense killed God in the process. But ironically and satirically, in the 40K War, as we all know, when he was sat upon the golden throne after nearly, or some claim actually, being slain by Horus. He became that god he had worked so hard to uproot for the Imperium itself. And what I thought would be interesting is to create a world where, rather than believing that God or your gods are dead, that the inhabitants would have to come to terms with God existing, right? God being the God they believe in, right? Yeah. Being out there, knowing of its existence, but knowing that it simply does not care about you. Yeah. That you are inconsequential. That Gelida as a world is simply of no consequence to the Imperium or the Emperor. Because I mean, there is, remnants of the Imperium itself on Gelida, but they have been ignored apathetically for so long, for such a millennia, or that there's no one left alive who's ever seen someone from the Imperium on the planet, even though they live and breathe, inside of, for the city of Demina. I mean, they're in a small hive city. It is a hive city, and they're operating, albeit haphazardly stuck together vehicles, committing heresy essentially. But I mean, they are imperial vehicles often that they are putting together ramshackle style.
Yeah.
So, they have evidence that the God they believe in, the Emperor and the Imperium, that should, in some abstract sense, exist. It just simply doesn't care about them. And the same goes for the followers of Chaos. The followers of Chaos on Gelida have spent who knows how long, with offerings and gifts and sacrifices and anything that they could to appeal to the Chaos gods. But Gelida is just of no consequence. Not even to Tzeentch. Not even to Tzeentch, my friend. That is how pathetic this planet is in the eyes of a god who knows everything, essentially. The all-seeing planner, and to Khorne, and to Nurgle, and to Slaanesh, and all the minor gods. No one cares about Gelida. They just don't. It's worthless. It's less than worthless. It's not worth acknowledgement to them. It doesn't even show up on maps anymore.
Yeah. So looking back, it's been years since I feel like the main thrust of Gelida happened.
Absolutely, yeah.
And how do you feel looking back at it? Like you said, you haven't released the codex. I think there's a bunch of I think before we started recording, I feel like you were talking about playing in music projects where the artifacts weren't left after the recordings or whatever, and there was sort of a melancholy about not producing the artifacts. Yeah. How do you feel about Gelida 3 years, two or 3 years out from it?
There are artifacts. There is evidence. There is testament to all of that's been produced in relationship to Gelida. There's photographs. There's stories that people have written. There is a codex that is out there. It's just missing the lore section. It's missing the narrative background, and its inner workings. So there are rules available, and there are plenty of people who have played their own Gelida events locally with their friends and posted those pictures and written reports. And that's the way that I wish it to be. I don't need to necessarily be a part of Jolita for it to live on.
Yeah.
And even if it were not to live on, I still feel that it accomplished to some extent what it is that we wished to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that I felt that I had learned from the experience. I wish that I had spent less time in preparing the events, trying to prepare things narratively, and found more ingenuitive ways to simply have people get together and play games and let them tell the story.
Mm.
Most 28 events function that way. Many of the events that John Blanche had participated in, the ones that they had run in Europe, were very much that way, where people had their war bands created for this particular setting, and then they would get together one day and everyone would play one massive game,
Yeah.
all at the same time. And much of people's turns was just narratively describing why their movement was taking the place the way it was.
Mm.
Because they were often so far away from each other
Yeah.
on any given board edge or table that the storytelling between every turn was far more important than anything that actually happened, as far as like rolling dice or game function was concerned. Everybody involved was more concerned with telling everyone else at the table
Do you feel
about
like that could
their
be
characters' motivations and
empowered
what was going
more?
on.
Do you feel like that could be like, I think
Yeah.
like I think people don't really know, looking from the outside, like when I first encountered like the story of Jolita and listening to you talk about it, it was like, oh my gosh, it's like a completely different way of looking at what happens at the table than I had ever even thought about. Like, and I was like, this is like an elevated literary experience that is real. Like, I didn't even know I was looking for it, but I was looking for it. Like, and it was like, I felt like I had like stepped into like a hole that was perfectly shaped for me. And I was like, oh, well, this Ink 28 thing, like I need to if I need to read all about this. But then you find out that there is no systematization of it. There's no, like, it's all emergent from people interacting. Do you feel like that it needs more systematizing, or do you feel like it just being this emergent thing is good and that's how it should stay?
I don't know. So it's tough. It's tough to really, I say, like, to find a balance there. I do fully agree that there something needs to take place amongst most 28 settings in most groups to introduce the players who are participating in a functional way to that idea.
Yeah.
That people can't be just left as babe wandering in the woods. If they wish to participate in 28, that we as active 28 community members, I think, should do our best in the future to brainstorm and try to find a proper way to convey how it is that we have played in events and how we participate in these niches, and what our best practices and what sort of things do you want to bring to the table, as far as what kind of qualities might, in an abstract sense anyways, not in a very strict sense, but in an abstract sense, what kind of narrative qualities and aesthetic qualities will best contribute to your 28 experience. Because I do think that if we worked hard enough, we could define it. It's difficult. It's very difficult. But I think with enough brain power that we could get to the point where we would have a definition in the abstract,
Yeah.
not one that's very strict, not very prescriptive, but to essentially say that like that when you're playing this game, there's a storytelling like there's a narrative motivation to the way that you play it, and everything that happens in your game that emerges, because 28 gaming I feel is very emergent, that things are going to happen in the game that you will not be able to plan for. But when it does, it's best to try to ascribe some level of meaning to those interactions. You're not going to get the full experience when you're playing in a 28 event if you show up and you've created like an Inquisimunda sort of rule set, and then you just play the game.
Yeah.
Right. And then afterwards you're like, oh, well, he won. That was crazy. That you're not, that's, you're missing so much of the boat.
Yeah.
So to speak. If every shot or every action, every movement that you're making you don't ascribe some level of meaning to it, that you shouldn't be saying that like this, that for example, right, before you show up to a 28 event, for anybody listening who's interested in participating in Inc. 28 events, one of the best ways to elevate your experience is to ascribe motive. Give your warband motives. They should have a reason for being at this place at this time, and they should all have goals in mind.
Yeah.
For example, the first 28 event that I participated in was called Mer Salam. It was a water world of a kind. Literally think of Waterworld with Kevin Costner. It was very much inspired by those kind of aesthetics, with a lot of Ian McHugh style airships. That was kind of the overview of what the world was like. Cool. Before ever setting foot in the room where that event happened, naturally speaking, I didn't know that it would elevate my 28 gaming experience. I didn't know that it was something I was supposed to do, but just by default, I felt that because we were all getting together to play with this small group of highly converted and specialized miniatures, that every single miniature that I brought should have a name, and they should all have their own goals, and that all of them have some sort of motivation that unifies them. There's a reason that they're together as a warband. And that's why, as in a broad stroke, just to make the story short, my group were essentially a bunch of eco-terrorists.
Nice.
There were we all knew that Isaac Tobin was working on a sky whale. It was going to be kind of like the grand finale, that he was going to bring this sky whale, and there was going to be some sort of game that was kind of centered around it. None of us had figured out what or why yet, right? But we knew that it was going to be prominently featured. So to tie my group into the world of Mer Salam more, I made their primary function as a crew to preserve sky whales.
Oh, nice.
They were essentially whale wars, but a Necromunda warband.
Cool.
So
that's sick.
So their job essentially was to show up and to protect the sky whales and to eliminate anyone who might threaten them, which created a natural adversarial relationship between my crew and other crews.
Yeah.
Which created a natural bond with any crews that shared the same philosophy, although there wasn't any.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, I hope that we can find a way to convey those concepts of gaming to the community at large. I think the best thing to start with is just the Inquisitor book. If you're listening to this and you're like the 28 style of gaming and painting and the philosophies surrounding it, do everything you can to get your hands on a copy of the original Inquisitor book. That's where it's all started. And I know it's a failed game. I know that it didn't take off like as a whole, that there's a reason it's discontinued. But if you can get your hands on that book and just read through how that game was played, you will find not necessarily the motivation to play with the Inquisitor rules. It's a little difficult, at least for me. I find it a little bit difficult to play with Inquisitor rules just because I have a hard time remembering a whole lot of rules, and it's it's a brand new sort of rule set. It's not exactly the same as playing 40K or playing Necromunda, but the philosophies that underpin the rules design in that sort of perfect balance between a tabletop war game and the storytelling of a role-playing game, that you'll I think become more in tune with what it is that we're all talking about when we're talking about starting a setting, when we're talking about doing a 28 event.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. And I love thinking about a rule set abstractly and trying to like maybe isomorphically transform it into something else. Like it's like, there are these sort, like if you think about Inquisitor abstractly, it allows you to kind of pivot certain concepts into maybe a more elegant game.
Like before you build your miniature, think of what exactly it is that you want to convey, and then find pieces of miniatures that convey that, or sculpt miniatures that convey that, or whatever you have to do. And then after that's done, you will have a physical representation, hopefully, of exactly what it is that you wish to convey. And then give it whatever damn rules it needs. Think of exactly what it is that it is supposed to do, and then give it those rules. Don't be too overly concerned about balance or point structure or any of those kind of things, unless you have a system in mind that you want to play within. Then just give it whatever you need to give it. For example, we all use Necromunda quite a bit. We all use Mordheim quite a bit, whether you're playing Ink 28 or Dark Age of Sigmar. Those are very popular systems. But if you have a miniature in front of you that has a whole bunch of a strange menagerie of, whether it be like weapons or a strange body structure, or maybe it's a much larger miniature than usually is seen in the rule set that you have, just give it whatever it needs. Give it more wounds, give it more toughness, give it a gun that doesn't come with the faction that you picked. Like, just give it whatever it needs to be the way that it is. And rules be damned. Talk to your friends and just increase the point cost by some amount that you agree upon. Because at the end of the day, if you're participating in these 28 events, or you're trying to build one of these projects, first and foremost, you need to do it with like-minded individuals who are really on the same page as you. And if they're on the same page as you, they are not going to care that you made a miniature with a couple special rules that you wrote yourself and some guns that it's not supposed to have. No one is going to care about that. If you are all in the 28 mindset, they're going to be happy you did. They're going to be like, thank God you are doing something interesting. Thank God I get to see what this thing was actually supposed to do in your mind's eye. That you thought up a concept, you thought up a creature, you thought up a whatever this being is, and then you made it, and you told us exactly what it would do within this system, and now we get to experience it, whether or not those rules exist, whether or not it's in a Necromunda book somewhere, whether or not you're following all of the the restrictions and prescriptions that come with that particular rule set.